Joining me to go head-to-head are Jane Donnelly, who's Human Rights Officer at Atheist Ireland, and Colum Kenny, who's Emeritus Professor of Communications at TCU and a former member of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. Now, I'm sure that you're well aware that you'll be voting in the presidential election this coming Friday, but there is a second vote for you to make a decision on. You'll be asked whether you think the offence of blasphemy should be removed from the Constitution. This involves removing the word blasphemous from a section of the Constitution that relates to balancing free speech with certain restrictions. That one word means the government must legislate for blasphemy, and the law relating to this was brought in back in 2009. So it is an offence if you publish or say something that is grossly abusive or insulting in relation to matters held sacred by any religion, and in doing this, if you cause outrage amongst a substantial number of the followers of that religion, and with the intention to cause that outrage. Now, the polls at the moment are indicating that many people are still undecided, so hopefully this debate can help you make up your mind. Jane, I might start with you, because the polls are also indicating at this stage that it's likely to be a yes vote, as in yes to removing it from the Constitution. So can you tell me why you're advocating for a yes?
I'm advocating for a yes vote on Friday to support freedom of religion and belief and freedom of speech. Our laws should protect people from harm, not protect ideas from criticism. Blasphemy is a medieval crime added to our Constitution in 1937 and crowbarred into our statute books a decade ago. It causes our media outlets to self-censor themselves, and it breaches our international human rights obligations. Also, states that execute people for blasphemy have cited the Irish law at the United Nations as what they want introduced around the world. Every group set up to examine the Irish Constitution have concluded that the blasphemy law is obsolete. So have the Catholic and Protestant bishops and all of the political parties. And the Presbyterian Church has come out this morning as well. Voting yes is an obvious choice, but make sure you come out on Friday to make that choice and vote yes.
And Colum, you're on the other side of this, so why should people vote against removing it from the Constitution?
I actually agree with Jane in relation to freedom of expression. I'm a strong defender of freedom of expression. Every civilised country has limitations on freedom of expression, which are put there to protect the public, and they're balanced against the right of free speech. We don't allow someone to come along, for example, and to shout fire in a crowded cinema unless there really is a fire. We don't allow people to come along and incite hatred against gay people. So in the same way, our blasphemy law in practice, I know it's a strange old-fashioned word, but what we actually have since 2009 is some anti-hate speech legislation. And when the Convention of the Constitution looked at that, they were set up by Leinster House at a cost of 1.4 million a couple of years ago to have a look at this issue. They said it should be replaced by a provision against incitement to religious hatred, and they voted 53 to 80 to 38 in favour of that. Now, what the government has done is binned that report, and they're just simply talking about dropping a word from the Constitution, which I think is not a very significant thing to do. The blasphemy law hasn't done anybody any harm, and it may actually send a signal that will encourage people to use the kind of horrible, acrimonious kind of language that you see now in some social media, and that you hear increasingly in political debates right across the world. I think that they're wrong to do that. I think they should have taken the nuanced approach, the modern approach that the Convention on the Constitution recommended. As regards the other arguments that are made about Pakistan, for example, I'm totally against the way Pakistan uses blasphemy laws. I'm totally against the way the atheist government in Beijing persecutes Tibetan Buddhists. I'm totally against the way Buddhists in Myanmar persecute the Rohingya Muslim population. But I don't think that's what we're voting for on Thursday.
You mentioned there that it hasn't done anybody any harm, and it's true to say that nobody's ever been prosecuted over it. But is that really a reason to keep it in Irish law? Is there not a possibility that it could be used in the future and that it could do harm, serious harm to somebody?
I think the actual law we have has a lot of provisions in it to protect people who are having reasonable debates, intellectually, artistically. There are lots of defences, good defences to any possible prosecution, and I think the Stephen Fry case shows that clearly. There was a storm.
But should you have to do that? You said that there are good defences you can make. Should you even have to defend yourself against it?
I think there should be a provision that people who engage in hate speech are discouraged, and that if they do engage in hate speech that stirs up trouble, that there are penalties for that. I think that's how you protect real freedom of expression. I don't think you protect freedom of expression by simply abandoning it to the law of the jungle.
And Jane, just because Colum there mentioned that the Stephen Fry case, and I can come back to you on that afterwards as well, the Gardaí did launch an investigation after a member of the public complained about comments made by Stephen Fry in an RTE show, and some of the viewers might remember that. Now, they dropped that investigation because they failed to find a substantial number of outraged people, and that's one of the requirements in the current legislation that was introduced in the last 9 years or so. Do you think that this example, because some people have argued this, that it's an example of how hard it can actually be to prosecute somebody for it, or would you be hailing it as an example of why we should be voting yes?
I would indeed, because as Colum has just said there, it was investigated, the Stephen Fry thing, and it wasn't hatred. They looked at that case and they found it wasn't hatred, but they were going to investigate it under the blasphemy law, not the Incitement to Hatred Act. And the reason that they didn't go ahead with it is because they couldn't find a substantial number of people that were outraged. But that is not to say that they didn't investigate it, they didn't take the case on board. So if we leave that there is a possibility that we're inciting people to outrage. There will be another case will come along, and there will be a substantial number of people that could be outraged about it. There are many instances that you could look at, for example, the different types of cartoons and that, and you could incite people to be outraged. So you cannot really argue that what Stephen Fry said was inciting hatred. So it was blasphemy, and it is firmly in that category. And we have incitement to hatred laws, and I do think that maybe they should be strengthened, and I know Colum thinks that, but what you do is you engage in the democratic process. You send submissions to your TDs, and they are going to look at it now. Minister Flanagan has said he is engaging with the opposition parties on it, so that's how you engage in it. It is not by voting no on Friday. You vote yes to strengthen the laws if you feel that they need to be strengthened in that way. And it is irresponsible to vote no on Friday just because you don't agree with the incitement to hatred laws. You need to strengthen them, and if you want to do that, vote yes on Friday and engage with the democratic process.
And Colum, I'll just get you to come back in on the Stephen Fry case,
sure.
And also the suggestion that in the future there could be an encouragement for, to build up a group of outraged people to build a case.
Yeah, I mean, the people who keep citing Stephen Fry tend not to mention that when he actually saw the details of the Irish blasphemy law, he said it was a wonderful Irish solution, and indeed it's one we could advocate in places like Pakistan because it builds in all kinds of defences. As far as I'm aware from reports at the time, only one person complained about the Stephen Fry broadcast, which was a discussion with Gay Byrne in which Stephen Fry made statements about his atheism which were perfectly reasonable. They're the kind of things you can read in the Bible, in the book of Psalms, or in the book of Job. And I don't think any religious person would take offence. The person who made the complaint, as I understand it, made it because they wanted a debate about this. They actually weren't offended themselves. And the Gardaí were obliged to look at it because it was a criminal complaint, but they found no case. And it wouldn't have been enough even if they'd found some people outraged. You have to have the intention to engage in that outrageous behaviour in order to stir up trouble. So I think that, this has been looked at. There's no need to write to TDs. There was 1.4 million spent by our public representatives setting up the Convention and the Constitution. We got expert evidence on this, and they came back with a very clear recommendation, which was that instead of the blasphemy provision, we needed a modern provision that actually was explicitly about hate speech. I can't understand why the government has dropped that, and I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to go out and to vote no because they haven't been given the choice the Convention and the Constitution recommended, which would be the sensible way to go. We don't have to accept the government's agenda just because they say it has to be black or white, therefore you must vote for one or the other. I think you vote no to protect the Constitution against people who are toying with it for political reasons.
Jane, can I just ask you about this point on the Constitutional Convention? Because, I mean, you said yourself earlier there that if people wanted some kind of a clause or legislation to strengthen incitement to religious hatred as an offence, that they could, lobby TDs. But the Constitutional Convention, we did spend a lot of money on it, and this was their recommendation, to have a referendum on this whereby we would remove blasphemy from the Constitution, but that we would also replace it with a provision to include incitement to religious hatred. Did you agree with the Constitutional Convention recommendation that it should be replaced?
I agreed with the Constitutional Convention recommendation that it should be removed, and I didn't agree with the other one. But you must realise that it was a recommendation. All those bodies have recommendations. We've had a number of constitutional bodies over the years for decades, and they have all been saying that it is to be removed. We have the Venice Commission saying that blasphemy should go, that the way to put it into our laws and to strengthen our incitement to hatred laws. So just like any group that recommends different things, I think that the government made the right choice at the time to not go down that road. And one of the reasons that they did this is like a crowbar in our Constitution. You never know what something like that could lead to, and we know this through the 8th Amendment. We know what that amendment led to. So it is not the place in our Constitution. Blasphemy law has no place. It is not the place. Laws for incitement to hatred is the way to go, and it has been recommended by various constitutional groups as well as the Venice Commission and the UN. It will breach all our international obligations if we leave that blasphemy law there. There is no need for it. And as for the Stephen Fry thing, remember, somebody did complain, they did look at it, they did investigate it.
They had to.
Yeah, they had to. So
because the police and Gardaí have no alternative when a criminal complains, but they didn't do anything.
They didn't do anything and the reason that they didn't do anything, because there wasn't enough people outraged. So are we inciting outraged? As I've been campaigning on the street, I have met people that are outraged. Last evening somebody told me I was going to burn in hell. So there are a number of people out there that get
I've been getting
outraged.
That too. I've been accused of being alt-right because of my views, that I'm an American right-winger.
Yes, then why encourage that? Why encourage that?
Colum, I'm interested to hear from you. You might not agree with the fact that we're not following the advice of the convention, and you don't believe that this is the right referendum for us to be having. But we are having this referendum. It's happening on Friday. The wording is set. So, I mean, do you believe that the offence of blasphemy should be left in the Constitution?
I think until the government brings forward a proposal that is more constructive, people shouldn't accept a binary choice. If you go in to buy a car and the dealer says to you, you have to buy this car or that car, you'll tell him where to go. And this is effectively what's happening. Now, I think that's because the government wants a political win. And I have a lot of sympathy with Atheist Ireland in its project for a secular constitution. I think there are more important issues. I think, for instance, the property rights in the constitution have been used to protect speculation in property, and I think they'll also be used if the government moves to control national school education in a more constructive way. I think we could be having a referendum to allow the government, for instance, to nationalise primary school property. I think there are real issues in relation to freedom of speech too, in relation to things like defamation laws that are used to chill journalism, and the failure to provide for people to be able to actually use our legal system despite the guarantee in the Constitution that everybody should have equal access to the law. So I'm not arguing with groups like Atheist Ireland who have, serious intellectual agendas. I'm saying that the government is making it a political issue.
You don't think that blasphemy as an offence should be in the Constitution, though, right? Am I right in saying that?
I think there should be a hate speech provision in the Constitution. I think that's what blasphemy is at the moment, and I don't think it should be removed. I don't think the Constitution should be toyed with like this in respect of anything. It's the basic document of the state. When we have a good recommendation as to what should happen, the danger of taking it out is, at the moment, it's doing no harm. But if you take it out, I think it sends a signal that people can engage in a kind of attacks on vulnerable religious groups, that we don't want to encourage. We have enough of it at the moment on social media and discourse politically generally, from Brexit Britain through Trump's America to the Middle East and back around now to Northern Ireland, is fraught as it is. Why this now? And I think it's because the government is looking to be able to say, oh look, we're modernising Ireland. I think there's a lot of other ways that Leinster House could work on modernising Ireland.
But I suppose, like I said, this referendum is happening on Friday, and if there are people who, that might even agree on you on some of your points that it should be replaced with the incitement to religious hatred clause, or, that there may be more important issues that they feel should be looked at instead. It is happening, and if they agree that blasphemy as an offence should be removed from the Constitution, why should they not take this opportunity, which might be the only one they'll get for a long time, to vote it out of there?
Because they're being manipulated, that's why. They should say no, it's doing no harm at the moment. It's not going to change anything taking it out of the Constitution for now. It's a clear message to the government that if you're going to bring forward constitutional provisions, if you want to be serious about free speech, if you want to be serious about secularisation, this is fiddling. This is fiddling while Rome burns. There are far more serious issues in this country at the moment. And the government wants to be able to say, and the politicians of Leinster House want to be able to say, look at how modern a society Ireland is. Well, Ireland isn't a modern society in many ways. Our broadband system, our healthcare system, our Garda system, our educational system, our green laws are among the worst in Europe. Taking the word blasphemy out of the Constitution will allow the government to trumpet something that is a lie.
Okay, Jane, just one final question before we wrap up for you. There are a lot of undecided voters in this referendum, and obviously it hasn't received as much attention as the last referendum that we had. For people who might agree with some of Colum's points, or who just feel like it won't affect them, so why bother voting at all? Why would you urge them to get out there and vote on Friday?
Because blasphemy law must be removed from our Constitution. And Colum actually said something quite dangerous there. He's linking blasphemy to hate speech. So that means that he's implying that Stephen Fry got investigated for hate speech. And that's an outrageous thing to imply. So we need to get it out of our Constitution. We need to support victims of blasphemy around the world. Particularly in Pakistan, we need to send a message that says we do not agree as a country with blasphemy laws, and we need to vote yes on Friday.
Can I say something about the Pakistan thing, which keeps being brought up? And it's not about Jane particularly. The government is saying it too. Creating a Muslim bogeyman in this referendum, in my opinion, talking about Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, where we all know there are problems, is all very well. And they may well, and they do, and Pakistan has, I understand, cited the Irish blasphemy law in defence of its own, which is a completely different kind of blasphemy law. I really think it's a kind of stereotyping of Muslims.
I disagree with that.
Can I just finish the point? Because I think it needs to be said, and I'm not saying you're doing that, but there is an international organisation, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, that represents over 50 Muslim countries, with a population of nearly 2 billion people, and they are committed to religious tolerance. And their commitment, their statement on this has been endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly. I think we toy with that very carefully. And apart from that, I think there's something risible about the notion we're going to make a difference. Do you think people in the extreme Islamic uplands of Pakistan are going to care any more about what we say in Dublin than the people in South Armagh during the Troubles would have cared what Islamabad said? I think there's that some people, Atheist Ireland have a very reasonable long-term position, and they have worked to do away with hatred in various forms in the religious sphere, and I think that's very good work. But I think from a political perspective, I think for politicians to be hauling in random countries, if we're that committed to changing the laws in Saudi and Pakistan, are we prepared to introduce economic sanctions? We'll see how much our principles are worth then if you ask that question, because I can bet the government is not about to advocate economic sanctions in relation to the blasphemy laws in either Saudi Arabia or Pakistan.
Jen, I'll let you come back in there quickly.
When I go over to the UN or the OSCE, there are NGOs from those various countries in those places, and they always say to me, what have you done? What have you done? Why did you introduce a blasphemy law in this century? They ask us, why have you supported that? And I have to explain to them, I'm embarrassed as an Irish citizen to explain to them that it wasn't us, it wasn't Atheist Ireland, that we are trying to get that out of our Constitution. And they beg us to campaign and do something about that. So ordinary citizens in those countries are asking for that law to be removed. They are pointing to Ireland and saying, please remove that. Send a signal to Pakistan, to other countries that have blasphemy laws, and get that out. We cannot have that in our constitution because it is causing persecution in other countries, and we need to remove it.
Well, I don't agree it's causing persecution. I understand your argument, and it's quite reasonable in some ways. But I mean, our blasphemy law is much more nuanced, and we can use that to advocate a better kind of blasphemy law in those countries. This argument that we should be embarrassed by something.
You do that through incitement to hatred, and you campaign.
Which is what the Convention on the Constitution recommended.
Not only the Convention on the Constitution, there were a number of other constitutional groups formed, as well as the Venice Commission, that have all recommended that it be removed, as well as the UN.
Can I say on the question of embarrassment, I mean, people have been suggesting they were embarrassed by British media coverage of Stephen Fry. I think the British media...
I'm not.
You mightn't be, but that has been the implication of some of what I've read. And I think, you're talking of a country on the other side of the pond in which you have to belong to the Church of England to be head of state, and you can't marry out
Well, it's not.
a Catholic.
I'm talking about... I was embarrassed.
Other countries have their own things to
When
be
you have
embarrassed.
somebody facing you from an NGO in another country, and they're asking you, what have you done? I was embarrassed.
Yeah.
And it was a human feeling to be embarrassed as being an Irish person, because we have a blasphemy law when people that they know are suffering persecution in their country.
I'm going to cut in here. I think we'll, before we start going around in circles of this, we'll leave it there. I'd like to thank Jane Donnelly for joining us, and also Colum Kenny for a robust debate. And I really hope that it's helped people who were undecided to make some kind of a decision ahead of Friday. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.